something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. To get early access to episodes of Devil's Chess Club, please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. This episode will soon be available to everyone, courtesy of the new documentary film series, Four Died Trying, which premiered on November 22nd on Apple TV and other streaming services. Four Died Trying explores the extraordinary lives and calamitous deaths of President John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert F. Kennedy. The next chapter should be available around New Year's Day, I'm told. I hope you enjoy the show, and deepest thanks again to Four Died Trying. In today's show, I am joined by Dan Kovalik, an American human rights lawyer, labor rights lawyer, and peace activist. He has contributed articles to CounterPunch, the Huffington Post, and TeleSUR. He teaches international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, or at least he did until he retired recently, as I understand. And he has written a number of books, including No More War, Cancel This Book, The Progressive Case Against Cancel Culture, and the upcoming book, The Case for Palestine, Why It Matters and Why You Should Care. The book will be out in early 2024, and I will put the pre-order link in the show notes. Dan Kovalik, it's great to have you back.
Great to be back, Aaron. Thank you very much.
So you have been very busy lately. You've traveled a bit around the world. Can you discuss some of your travels in recent weeks?
Yeah, well, I was just to the west. I went to the West Bank of Palestine a couple weeks ago, which was pretty incredible, actually, and made it to Bethlehem, which during this time of year is pretty amazing. Though Bethlehem, I should say, there was no indication that Christmas was happening in Bethlehem, and there's a good reason for that. The Christian patriarchs actually wrote Joe Biden and told them that Christmas was canceled in Bethlehem because of what was happening in Gaza. They did not feel that it was appropriate to celebrate anything. So there's no Christmas trees or ornaments or lights on the streets. And that's pretty profound. I mean, again, to start just at any random place, I mean, people need to understand that there's many Palestinian Christians. Palestinians were the first Christians, right? And Israel's been very tough on the Christians in Palestine, including in Gaza, where they blew up the third oldest Christian church in the world. And over the last 24 hours or so, they invaded with the Holy Family. Was at a church, I believe, in Gaza, and shot a woman and a child there. It's really terrible what Israel's doing. And again, you can see that in the West Bank. Obviously, it's not as bad as what's happening in Gaza, but the violence by Israeli military and settlers has really increased since October 7th. About 300 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since that time, which is more than was killed in all of 2022. And about 3,000 people have been taken prisoner by Israel since October 7th, mostly young men. And so it's, I would say the mood in the West Bank is very somber because of what's happening to themselves, but I would say more because of what they see is happening in Gaza.
Right. Is there a sense that Gaza, I mean, the reality of Gaza would be, it's a different dynamic over there in terms of the way the population is dispersed and everything else, and then the settlements kind of are, interspersed throughout Gaza or throughout the West Bank. Is the sense that that sort of terror could be headed for them next, though, on a different? It would look different, but with the same kind of effect. I mean, do they? What do they think Israel's plan is for the?
I think most people, as far as I could tell, are in denial of that possibility, because they have lived better than the people in Gaza for quite a long time, because their government, the Palestinian Authority, is very much, a collaborator with Israel. They very much have a go along, get along attitude with Israel, and in return, the Palestinians in the West Bank have been allowed to live a better life than the people in Gaza. And the Palestinian Authority, kind of trumpets that, saying, "Oh, look, because of our, collaborationist policies, you guys are doing well." And in Ramallah, which is where I stayed, that's a kind of the de facto capital of the West Bank. Again, it looks fairly prosperous, and people do fairly well there, though the economy, of course, in the West Bank has been hurt greatly by the conflict. And also Israel. So how it works is Israel collects taxes, customs taxes, and others that they're supposed to share with the Palestinian Authority, to because the Palestinians pay taxes too, right? But they haven't been paying those to the Palestinian Authority for like 4 months. So, there's a lot of suffering that's happening in the West Bank. But again, it's not anything compared to what's happening in Gaza. There is not that mass. They're not being bombed from the air, though, like the Jenin refugee camp is being terrorized for sure in the West Bank and some other places. But again, in places like Ramallah, yes, there are, the military forces do come in there. They arrest people, they do kill people, and that happened while I was there. But that's a very sporadic thing. It's not this, relentless assault like in Gaza. So I think a lot of people are hoping that what's happening in Gaza will not come to them, but some of my more politically astute friends there do realize that's a possibility, that after the Israelis dispense with the people in Gaza, that they may be coming for them in a very big way. And yet probably won't take the form of aerial bombings like is happening in Gaza, but it could be very, very destructive. And of course, um, since October 7th, the demolition of Palestinian homes has really increased. The settler takeover of Palestinian homes has increased. The Israeli settlements are being built, at a breakneck pace. You can see that construction all over. So they're definitely trying to squeeze the Palestinians out of the West Bank. I mean, I think their goal, the Israelis, if they had their druthers, they would force the people from the Palestinians in the West Bank to Jordan, and the people in Gaza into Egypt.
Right,
Um,
that seems to be pretty clearly what they were trying to do. I mean, this was leaked by that Israeli, someone in the Israeli
yeah,
intelligence
intelligence
services leaked that
services. Yeah.
report on how all the other options were unsatisfactory, but sending them into the Sinai Desert, that was the real winner. That's what they should do.
Yeah. Yeah. And clearly that's the goal. Now, whether they are able to accomplish that, I mean, obviously, I hope not. But that is the goal, and we'll see. We'll see. I mean, if that happens, the Biden administration would forever be remembered by that. You know, um, if 2 million people are sent into the desert, living in tents, I mean, my God. Um,
Yeah, there's an article in the at the Cradle today, and this is the graphic that they made for it. But the title is "Diverging Paths: The U.S.-Israel Divide Over Post-War Gaza," and it's reasonably, I mean, it lays out the argument for there being a divergence in what the U.S. is advocating for what Israel is seeking to achieve here. I mean, it seems clear that Israel and Netanyahu, I mean, explicitly has done everything to very deliberately make a two-state solution impossible, which to me is the one reason why I think that people on the left and people who are pro-Palestinian shouldn't say, "Oh yeah, it's completely unworkable," because in a sense that is the Netanyahu, that has been his goal of his particular contingency in that country. And then so there is this question of what the U.S. will want to do or will allow Israel to do. Would they stand up to them if Israel just started to, after demolishing all these areas, just started slowly encroaching into those places that it's demolished, and doing what it's done in the rest of so much of that territory. So, do you think that this is really a important division, or is this just theater and they're really and in the end the U.S. won't stand up to anything Israel wants to do, because that's how it seems to be largely going so far?
Yeah, I mean, the evidence seems to support the case that there is no true divergence because while Biden, yes, he's making some noise that he wants Israel to stop killing civilians in the way they are. And the Biden administration has at least said that they do not want any diminution in the area of Gaza and certainly do not want the Gazans to be pushed out of that area. Um, their actions belie that because while Netanyahu is carrying out these horrible massacres um, in Gaza, and while now over half the population of Gaza is starving due to Israel's actions, what is Biden doing? He just recently sent 2,000-pound bombs to Israel to use against Gaza. He's been working behind the scenes of Congress to remove all human rights restrictions, all restrictions indeed, on Israel's ability to access reserve armaments and munitions, which no president has ever done. Of course, he's seeking this $14 billion in emergency aid to Israel. So I think he's not serious about what he's saying. I think what he is those statements Biden is making about having a divergent path from Netanyahu are not meant for Netanyahu to hear. They're meant for his base to hear. Biden wants his cake and eat it too. He wants to tell his base, I'm a good guy. I think Netanyahu's a bad guy. He and I are not on the same page. I just want you to know that. But meanwhile, I'm going to give him everything he wants to do his dirty deeds, right? We'll see how well that works for him. Sadly, the polls seem to suggest it's not working badly for him because his poll numbers seem to be largely sustaining themselves. So,
Because who else? Where else is there? I mean, who is the pro-Israel? I mean, who is the pro-Palestinian, pro-peace candidate? There is none. I
well,
mean,
that is what Biden is counting on, that he's not Trump. I mean, that will win the day for him. And again, it worked for him in 2020, and it could work for him again, of course, which is a shame. And I think Democrats who oppose what's happening in Gaza should make it clear that they will just abstain from the election or vote for a third party candidate, that they won't vote for him even though they don't like Trump. I mean, that they will punish him for what he's doing.
yeah,
But
there's no. I mean, if Cornell had stayed on the Green Party ticket, there would be a viable peace candidate, but
I guess Jill
or I mean,
Stein
semi-viable, but
yeah,
like,
I guess Jill Stein is running as the Green Party candidate, and I guess she has a good position on Palestine. So I don't know, maybe people will vote for her, but I do think that now there's like enough of a field of third party candidates that they're going to kind of cancel each other out, right? I mean, they kind of have to get together, I would think, to have any impact on this election. And I don't even know if Cornel West is still running. I mean, I'm sorry, his candidacy is a joke. I mean, he's not serious.
I yes, that's been a very disappointing thing. I think there's he never came up with an adequate explanation as to why, after in days after Robert Kennedy announced that he would run as an independent, that he was going to run as an independent. That and those two things I don't think are coincidental. Now I think I don't have a. Do you have any theory as to why? I have some vague hypotheses about why he did this, but why do you think he did that?
I mean, honestly, I don't know if there's a lot of rhyme and reason to what he's been doing. I mean, he started out with the People's Party. Am I correct about that? And then he went to the Green Party very quickly after that. And then he went to being an independent. I mean, I'm sorry, like I don't know if he even really wants to run for president or he just wants to make a point or something. I mean, none of this is calculated to have any chance of impacting the election. So, and again, my guess is by November you won't even hear the name Cornel West. That's my guess.
You might hear it come up in conversation, but not
Yeah,
in the news.
yeah, not in pleasant conversation. No, I'm kidding. Not in polite conversation. No, but yeah.
I mean,
He-
I had thought that perhaps his run was that potentially people around him that were. I mean, I thought that perhaps his entry into the race was an anti-RFK thing. Perhaps that was a possibility. Now, I'm not saying I think that I know that that's the case, or that I even really think very strongly that it is. But I thought that was a possibility, maybe with the idea that you don't really that it would hurt Kennedy's chances in the Democratic primary if he was running in the primary if there was a more full-on peace candidate who was nominally of the left more than Kennedy is for sure. So that was what I thought at the time, but I don't really know if that's the case. Now, when he left the Green Party because of Kennedy, I tended to think that it may have had something to do with his vanity, really, that he does not want to be as a Green Party, he would be on the ballot. He could potentially be a spoiler for a Democratic administration, and that his vanity could not suffer being hated like that.
Right. Well, he does seem like a very vain person, and again, not a serious person is the truth. There's certainly not a serious political candidate. That's my view, and that's a shame. We need a serious third party run, and he certainly has some good views. But again, he's not going to be the guy to deliver at all. He can't deliver. He will not get on many ballots,
No,
if
I
any.
have
I mean,
I can't see how he would be able to,
no,
and that should have been clear, very clear, from anybody looking at his situation back when he made that decision to leave the Green Party.
yeah. So maybe
So
you have a writing campaign, which again is just silly to.
yes, this brings us to the issue of like what is going to stop this juggernaut of. I mean, I wrote about in my dissertation, in my book, I write about the U.S. empire, and that's my main focus. But this has brought into relief in my mind something even more, which is like, it's not like I didn't know this before, but it's like it really hammers it home. At the end of World War II, we embarked on two insane projects, which is global dominance, indefinitely for the U.S. empire, and then Zionism at the end of World War II.
Which is part of our global dominance. It's kind of a subset of the
That's
global
just it,
dominance.
and that's what makes it difficult to even know what to attribute to what. What can you attribute to the U.S. and what can you attribute to, Zionism and its takeover of foreign policy? In a sense, neoconservatism is virtually interchangeable from that in terms of its agenda. So how do these things get wound down? Because they both seem to be doing terribly right now. I mean, people are leaving Israel in large numbers in recent years. Netanyahu was embroiled in scandal, perhaps headed to jail before this. Things are going terrible in Ukraine. For the U.S., I mean, it's a disaster. It's a debacle that makes it that in some ways is worse than Iraq, although it's not hard. It's hard to say. But the more you look back on this, it's like the whole 21st century has been a series of catastrophic blunders of imperial hubris, and now it does seem that I don't think it's a coincidence that as things are going so badly, Israel seems to be thinking that they need a final solution for Gaza, for example. So what do you think has how strong do you see U.S. imperialism and Zionism at this moment? What are their prospects 10 years from now?
Yeah, I mean, I do think they're weakening. I mean, and I think what will end those things is that they will be defeated. I mean, in the same way that in the end, the Vietnam War was ended by the fact that the Vietnamese won. They outlasted the U.S. in this war of attrition. But the peace movement was certainly important. Played a role in certainly, I'm certain, giving morale to the Vietnamese. And but reality will assert itself, and the reality is that Zionism is not sustainable, and Israel is not sustainable in the way it is because, as you say, about I think 500,000 Israelis left after October 7th, feeling that they weren't secure there. Um, and the U.S. empire goes from defeat to defeat. If you ever listen to Colonel Douglas McGregor, who was in Trump's, National Security Council, he always jokes, that, we don't win any of these wars, and he's like, we're training Ukraine to fight Russia. We can't beat Russia. What do we have to train them? We don't win ourselves. So I do think that the empire is going down. Sadly, they'll probably take a lot of people with them. Um, but how soft the landing is going to be depends on how the U.S. responds to these defeats and whether they accept defeat or they continue to try to fight their way out of this, which is just very dangerous. And the real one of the positive hopes is that there are unprecedented demonstrations in the U.S. against the war in Palestine, which is a beautiful thing. I'm surprised by it. Everyone I know is surprised by it. The Palestinians are surprised by it. A number of people told me how happily surprised they were to see all these demonstrations. So the peace movement seems to be revived or is getting revived from this. Meanwhile, the war machine is overstretched in a big way. As you say, they tried to have this confrontation with Russia through Ukraine, which was a big task, and that is failing. And now they want to support Israel in this genocidal war in Gaza. And honestly, while the genocide is going fairly well for Israel, the war against the militants is not. They're not winning militarily against the militants. I mean, the militants are handing it to Israel, and Hezbollah is handing it to them, and Yemen is now shutting down the Red Sea. I mean, Israel's got some trouble here. They have very big trouble, I think. And so I do see hope for change. And again, a lot of it is going to be because of people resisting all of this.
Right, and I was thinking about what the post October 7, siege would what it's going to look like, what it's going to look like when this is done. And if Israel, even if Israel succeeds in somehow getting the Palestinians, to the people of Gaza, into Egypt, which seems to be their goal, I don't think that that it would be rational for them to want to just kill everyone there without letting them leave, because that would seem to be even bad optics, even more than they would want to tolerate. But who knows? I wouldn't have thought that they would do this the way that they have. But the international, you look at this long term, it seems that the international community is not going to be very friendly to Israel as the U.S. power diminishes, and nothing seems to be reversing that big overall tectonic shift, such that Israel is now making it that America is its only protector and only real defender anymore. Although, how much was that always the case? But it didn't seem like it was always the case, as long as the U.S. had the ability to tell so many other countries what to do. But as the U.S. position diminishes, what would these other countries want to have to do with Israel? I mean, it seems like their populations would want to make them the ultimate pariah state. And if the U.S. power continues its decline, which there's no reason to think it won't, it seems that Israel would be very isolated. So it seems to me that Israel's interest would really be to soberly look at all the current trends and think we really should go for a two-state solution. It's actually the best deal we could hope for long term. But I mean, what what do you see happening to the? How do you think the international community will respond to Israel after the fact? If they annex that territory and just start and they get rid of the Palestinians, I mean, what would the rest of the community, the international community do?
I do think they will be looked at as a pariah state. And I do think you could see an oil embargo against them. You could see real economic measures against them by a number of states that would really be impactful. And again, they've already lost billions of dollars up till now since October 7th. They're going to lose billions more. And if countries stop trading with them, which I think could happen, they're going to be in great trouble. The other, of course, thing that they've lost for the first time in 75 years is their claim to moral righteousness. I mean, a lot of people saw through that, but certainly I think most people in the West bought that, right? Israel, you know, frankly, has been very manipulative in playing off, what happened in the Holocaust to kind of drape themselves in the mantle of goodness. And that mantle's gone. I mean, people now are seeing what they're doing in Gaza. They can't go back to that. And that's true even amongst young, especially young Jews in the West. I mean, Israel's always had a demographic problem, or they've always been struggling to maintain even parity with the Palestinians in terms of numbers in what Israel, Palestine, whatever you want to call it. Now they're going to be desperate. They're not going to have people flocking to live in Israel anymore.
And they're not, the people that are going to flock there are not going to be the people you would want to be building
No,
a
they're going to
normal
be very
country
bad
with.
people, and that's been true for a while. That's why Israel's gone really far to the right. There's no progressives moving to Israel anymore. No, I think that they really, the truth is, while they look like they're winning again because they're just racking up a huge body count, they're losing. I mean, they're losing badly. And here's the problem, though. Netanyahu, and you touched on this, he's such a horrible leader. Why? Because a lot of what he's doing is not to save Israel. He's ready to burn Israel to the ground to protect himself from going to jail. All right. A lot of what he's doing is to stave off being, tried on corruption charges and going to jail. And he thinks if he can keep this war going, he's going to do that. Can you think of a worse reason for, engaging in massacres than that? But that's true. He's a very self-interested guy. And again, he's ready to burn his own country to the ground to save his own ass. That's just the truth of it. And that's why he's not thinking rationally, or not. He may be thinking rationally for his own self, but not for the sake of Israel.
Yeah, I mean, it brings to my mind the situation that Lyndon Johnson was in November of 1963. When Kennedy was killed, Time or Life magazine was about to publish this huge article about the corruption in the Senate that he had been a part of. Bobby Baker, scandal, who was like his own weird version of a Jeffrey Epstein back in the day. Somebody who was involved in sexual blackmail and all sorts of other corruption. And then he gets into office, and it's like when you have an obviously corrupt person running things, I mean, they seem easily owned by the most belligerent actors.
Yeah, and Biden the same. Biden, part of his motivation for doubling down on Ukraine has been to hide his own corruption in Ukraine, right? He doesn't want to be tried for that, impeached for that. So both these guys, you now have these two guys who wield immense power that are acting out of the most, selfish and corrupt motivations. I mean, that should scare people very much.
Now, what do you make of the reports? Because we've seen some of these. This gets back to kind of the origins of this whole thing. But if you look at this picture that I'm using for the graphic here today, um, I mean, these cars that were apparently destroyed by Apache helicopters, it doesn't look like Palestinians with those M80 rockets that they have. Or like, I don't think that this was done by Hamas,
No.
right? I mean, and Mearsheimer was recently on in an interview saying that he thinks that, I mean, that a lot of the civilians were killed by Israelis on that day.
Yeah, well, I
I mean, I
think that's
would wonder.
coming out. It's coming out. Haaretz, of course, has run some stories about that. I mean, that appears to be true. Yeah.
Right. So to me, it raises the question of what was the actual operation that Hamas and those other groups carried out. Were they targeting civilians at all to be killed, or were they trying to take them hostage? How many of the how many civilians did they actually kill? I would really like to know that, and I don't feel that there's I don't think anybody can give an answer with any amount of certainty to that question. I mean, based on what you've seen, what do people think about that?
Yeah, well, there's, some people in Israel are calling for investigations into that. But will those investigations ever come? I mean, we may never know because again, now Netanyahu's doubling down in Gaza because now he wants to hide that scandal. That's an even worse scandal than he had before October 7th, right? Again, this is very Nixonian what's happening here, right? Um, and so we'll see. But I do agree with you. I think that it's coming out that Israel's responsible for a lot of those deaths. And of course, now you have the three Israeli hostages with white flags who were killed by Israeli forces in Gaza. And they had their hands up, and the one guy was speaking Hebrew, and they were shot anyway. All this lends credence to the idea that the Israeli armed forces are completely out of control. At best, they're out of control, or at worst, they're actually engaged in the Hannibal directive, right, where they will kill people who are going to be taken hostage, so just so they're not taken hostage, or maybe they even kill their own hostages, or kill their own people who are hostages. But again, at a minimum, it shows that their um, rules of engagement are such that they kill everything that moves. I mean that's what is becoming evident to people.
As this goes on, how much do you think that this question is going to linger in people's minds? Because it does seem so much like they wanted a pretext to do this insane this agenda, which is essentially an eliminationist agenda. It looks like. I mean,
Yes, it
do you
does.
think that there's any chance that we will get a detailed investigation of this, or will we just be pondering this for many years?
I think we're as likely to get a detailed investigation of this as we have of the John F. Kennedy assassination. Um, I just think this is something that goes so much to the core of the identity of the Israeli government that it's just too hot to handle. Again, because if the truth came out, it would be fatal to the project. Again, in a way that the Kennedy assassination, if we truly knew what happened, would be fatal to the our very identity of ourselves.
Or at least the empire, I think. I mean,
Yeah,
my take on it is the empire killed JFK, and it's actually quite easy to understand if you think of it in those terms.
right.
Um, and so, but for me, the silver lining on the JFK issue is that with the empire no longer tenable, then what's the need of even defending that kind of a thing? And in fact, it could be a realist revelation, I think, to like confront the public and let the establishment kind of deal with that. But so far,
No, of course, we
they
all should be calling for that. I mean, right. I mean, it's the only way to truly, in this country, achieve democracy. And there, I mean, again, that sort of reckoning has to happen. But yeah, I mean, look, already people don't feel that the Israeli government is protecting them within Israel. The whole idea of the existence of Israel is to provide a safe haven for Jews. If they can't, if they're not only not providing a safe haven, but in fact are willfully murdering Israelis during a crisis, my God, yeah, what's the point of all this? I mean, that's what
Right.
I mean. This is an existential question that's being raised here.
And the bigger and another related question is, how can they credibly claim to be somehow protecting Jewish people when I think more and more people are arriving at the conclusion that the main driver of anti-Jewish sentiment in the world is the state of Israel, because the Israel says we are Judaism and Judaism is us, and only those who are self-loathing oppose us. I mean, this is, how long can these insane contradictions persist?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we can see insane contradictions last for a long time, but ultimately they do collapse. Ultimately, the flat earthers lose. Ultimately, again, reality asserts itself. You cannot fool reality forever, and I do think that day's coming where people are going to say, "Oh, now I get it. Now I get the fact that Zionism is not the same as Judaism, and in fact is in direct contradiction to it." In the same way that you know neocon values, even though put forth, sometimes in the name of Christianity, are anti-Christian. I mean, those things will collapse under the weight of their own untruthfulness and their own hypocrisy.
Or when the material, the ability to just tell everybody how it's going to be is no longer there, which also seems to be approaching, that day seems to be approaching for the US.
Yeah.
What do you make of the shift among the younger people? Because I think that this is, I feel like some of the identity politics and the sort of postmodern ethos of this obsession over individualism has been kind of stage managed by corporate elites as a way to manipulate the culture and kind of make people anti-materialist and not thinking about politics apolitically, basically, right? But I also think that sometimes they do things that have unintended consequences. Like, I think that the CIA and people like Tim Leary, I think a part of what they were doing back in the 60s was trying to like make the counterculture terrifying to middle America by injecting acid and all this craziness into the discussion. I've always sort of suspected that. But then even people like John Lennon are like, well, the CIA invented LSD, but they didn't control it. It has all these other consequences. I mean, to me, it seems that part of making people so obsessed with like the suffering of individuals who are oppressed, that is kind of the zeitgeist of activism in the U.S. to some degree, that this has made them look at what's happening in Palestine. And I mean, if people get worked up about, TikTok videos of some person complaining about, ableism or something, which may or may not be more serious in this or that case. But if people are that sensitive about things, it seems that like seeing what's happening in Palestine is horrifying to these people who wouldn't have necessarily even figured out what the real history and situation was over there. Like they seem to have really run into something that maybe they weren't quite expecting. Or what do you think about the way that the attitudes are shifting among the younger people?
Well, you raise a point I hadn't considered. I think it's a good point, but I think the other point is, and again, which is an unintended consequence of the people who make money from it, and that is social media. The young people do not get their nightly news from Fox or CNN or MSNBC. They get their news from TikTok and Twitter and Facebook. And those are places, while there is some censorship there, we know that. The truth is, on the Palestinian issue, on what is happening in Gaza right now, it's fairly unfiltered. You're seeing videos of kids dying and being pulled from rubble every minute on these platforms. And that's where young people are going. And that is why the narrative is broken down. Before social media, you only got your news from the nightly news and from the newspapers. And so Obviously, you had Chomsky, you had others who tried to go outside that and all, but most people, that's where they got their news. So it was very easy to manufacture consent. I do think they're struggling now to manufacture consent over this because they can't control all these images getting out to people, especially young people. I think social media is the best friend the Palestinians have ever had, and that's been true for a while. That they've been, one guy with a cell phone in the middle of Gaza is better than a whole crew from CNN. They can show you what's really happening, and that is what's destroying the narrative.
Right. It does. That does seem to be happening because I see more viscerally horrifying things coming out of there. I mean, infuriating things that I.
Absolutely. Every day it's something worse. Every day it's just, and again, this stuff has happened. That happened in Vietnam. This sort of thing that we're seeing, it happen in Iraq and Libya, but we didn't see it because it wasn't being covered. And now it's being covered, but it's being covered by, again, individuals with a cell phone. Not to also to detract from what very brave journalists are doing there, but not from our networks, mostly from networks like Al Jazeera and that sort of thing. But that stuff is people are seeing also on social media.
Now, one unhappy thing that we have to address is our our man Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is his main platform. If you go to his campaign website, is he's talking about peace and fighting corporate corruption and interests that have special interests that have diverted and undermined American democracy. But he is staunchly pro-Israel, and this seems to be totally incongruent with everything else that he's calling for. What do you make of his position on Israel, and is this going to damage his campaign? It's not that the other candidates are better. We know that they're not, but how do you see this impacting his campaign? Because it seems to have really hampered, or it's really put a damper on the support from the most activist parts of the anti-imperialism in the United States. So it's, how does this shake out for him?
I think it hurts him. I think, again, if he wants to attract young people, which I know he does want to do and he needs to do to win, um, he needs to have a different position on Palestine. I mean, could you imagine if he was showing up to rallies in support of Palestine? I mean, he would look like his dad driving around in those convertibles, shaking people's hands. At that time, it was him going to civil rights, marches
And doing things with Chavez or the Indian, the American Indian movement, and I
exactly
mean,
that would be the optics of it. Instead, he happens to run against the fact that since October 7th, this is the moral issue of the century till now. And he's on the wrong side of it, and it's going to hurt him very badly. And people are going to wonder what the difference is between him and the other two major candidates. He needed and needs to be vocal in a way that goes against the two parties. And he could be a hero, and he's chosen not to do that. He's chosen what he believes is the easier path, but it's not the path to victory.
right. It just seems that all that he would really need to do is adopt the standard U.S. position, which is a two-state solution and no wanton, brazen, large-scale slaughter and
Yeah,
expropriation. Even that would be, even though people would say, well, he's not going to do anything once in office, at least he would be saying something that would be calling for something different. I mean, people don't seem to grasp that what Biden is doing is a departure from U.S. policy, because we can see that the Israelis never attempted anything this brazen after 1948, even with the possible exception of the 6 Day War, which is again another case where you had a corrupt president in charge who seemed to be at the mercy of whether people would prosecute him for this or that. I mean, so that's, I think, noteworthy. But I this is a switch from what the U.S. policy has conventionally been towards Israel. If he would just return to that and call for a ceasefire, because this violence is unusual as well, he wouldn't even be. It's not like he'd be Roger Waters at that point. He would just be George W. Bush or Barack Obama.
Yeah, no, agreed. I mean, I think it's a mistake. I think it's a colossal mistake from a moral point of view, but also a political point of view. I think it will hurt him. It's not too late, I suppose, for him to change course, but I don't see him doing it, frankly. I mean, I think he's doubling down now on that position, and again, I think it will hurt him. I don't. I think it's short sighted on his part, and which is a shame because he tends to actually be pretty, intelligent guy and a guy who actually has long range views and sees the big picture. And that somehow the big pictures escaped him in this instance.
Right, because these other issues that he is much better than the others on are, in a bigger sense, more consequential than Israel-Palestine, although it wouldn't seem that way if you're looking at the horrors in Palestine. It's sobering if you think of what the U.S. empire does year in and year out. I wrote about this in my book, but it's something like 9 million structural violence deaths a year from the system of capitalism that the U.S. oversees. They could, with a fraction of a tax on billionaires or part of the Pentagon's budget, you could basically end those every year. So we preside over a Holocaust year in, year out, that is many times greater than like the whole population of Palestine. I mean, so this is a bigger issue of the whole world is really suffered, the whole global South, especially under U.S. hegemony. And so he's calling for winding that down. This is a huge change, and he's basically calling for negotiating how to solve problems with China and Russia. This is a template. What he's calling for in general would be the template to solve this particular crisis, and it fits perfectly with what he's saying. So why doesn't he just do it? All these problems are so solvable, or at least many of them are. There doesn't need to be any fighting with Russia. The Ukraine war didn't need to happen. There doesn't need to be a war in Taiwan or over Taiwan, and there doesn't need to be a war in the Holy Land. I mean, these are things that are very easily solvable if there's just the will to do it in the right places. And yet he is not, picking up the mantle of peace in this way.
No, I agree. And again, his position, which I support, is of trying to ratchet down the U.S. war machine, is in direct conflict with his position on Israel. The two cannot exist at the same time, which makes me fear, to be honest, that other goal of ending the endless war would collapse in the face of his Israel position. I mean, it makes me honestly wonder how serious he is about that other position, right? Because they can't go together,
I mean, his statements lend salience to people who would say that his campaign is a Israel lobby production. I mean, he's the independent guy, but is independent just like, is it really the Likud party that we're looking at here? I don't, it's really discouraging.
Yeah, it is. It's very discouraging, Aaron, because I did have some hope in him as a peace candidate, but I think it shows you, one, the power of the Israeli lobby, which is probably has power over him to some extent, but also the power of the military-industrial complex. I mean, I think by the time you get to November of an election year, the last people standing who are running have been vetted for those things. I mean, it's, those who questioned those, sacred cows of U.S. empire have fallen by November, and or have changed their views to be more in line with the military-industrial complex.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the bit of hope there is that potentially the situation in Israel may change dramatically to where possible lines of action are reduced. I mean, it may have less options available to it, and the U.S. empire's collapse is going to be more apparent, the collapse of U.S. hegemony is going to be more apparent, and that perhaps at that point pressure will, be applied to him or people around him that could allow for some modification of this, because I do believe that actually what he is calling for, his policies, are in the interests of even the class that the oligarchy that dominates U.S. politics. I think that they are headed for a reckoning if they do not change course. But what frightens me is that they seem to have lost the ability to function as good realists anymore. Like what they did with Russia and Ukraine is not just a colossal defeat for the U.S. And the U.S. empire, but it shows that there's a vacuum at the top, like that there's a mindlessness at the top that is horrifying and is not able to even assess or game out the consequences of its actions. So this to me is very disturbing.
Yeah, well, it's true. I mean, let's face it. We have a mindless president. We have a president who is not fully functional cognitively. Um, that someone like that is even the head of state, I mean, is reflective of where our political system is. I mean, I'm sorry, if the choice is going to end up being Trump versus Biden, what does that say about American politics? About really the just emptiness and corruption of our system. It says very bad.
It's amazing. It's never been this bad. Even
No,
under Bush, under George W. Bush, the liberal media, as it was back then, and the Democrats, there were at least signs of life.
right.
I have not seen anything like that currently about this. I mean, in the same way.
No, the liberal intellectual class is utterly disgraced itself over Ukraine, and now it's disgracing itself over Palestine. I mean, there just is no critical faculties left. And and the people who were, you look at Chris Hedges, who did write for the New York Times, he's now working for Al Jazeera. Seymour Hersh, a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, is now writing on Substack. I mean, you don't have those type of journalists in the mainstream media anymore. You have talking heads. They're just as empty as Joe Biden's brain. I mean, truthfully, I mean, it's pathetic. It is pathetic.
Yeah, and they get these guys in there. I mean, I want to talk about this because this was in the news about a month ago, maybe. You're running with John Fetterman, and now he's basically come out and said, like, I'm not a progressive. I never was. I'm a caveman or whatever. I'm a reactionary.
Right. I'm a Bob
I'm,
Casey Democrat. Bob Casey being the emptiest suit in the world. Yeah.
right. So, has there been any fallout from this? Have you been banished from the Senate building for all time just
Well,
because you
I don't
ran
know.
into him
I
somewhere in
haven't tried.
Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I haven't tried to go to the Senate building since then. No, so far I don't know that there's been any fallout. Um, I certainly have no regrets about my encounter. I feel I came out the better in that encounter. And I believe that people need to make these politicians, I don't think they should be allowed to be comfortable while they're supporting a genocide. I'm sorry, like wherever they're at, people should be bothering them and asking them, why are you doing this? So, um, and what happened to me didn't surprise me in the least. Again, it shows the fragility of these politicians. I mean, all he had to do is say to me, I hear you're saying, I'll think about it. He gave me some food for thought and then walk away, right? Instead, he had me thrown out before saying a word to me. And it's like, what does it say about his ability to even defend his own position? Or, it's just really, and it shows such contempt for his own electorate. I mean, I told him I had voted for him, and he didn't care. He doesn't even care about his own voters. Um, it's stunning. It's stunning, and you see this replay all the time with people who confront their elected officials. They don't represent us. It's just they don't. You know.
Yeah, I was talking to Larry Wilkerson last week, and he said something to me, which is like I think at some points I may have like the thought might have popped into my head, but I didn't really think too much of it. But now, in retrospect, it actually seems like it may be more important. He said that he thought that the reason Bush lost in 92 was that he went against Israel. That like the fact that he was telling Israel that like if they didn't work towards a two-state solution, U.S. aid might be called into question, might be reexamined. Which is, brings to mind JFK's letter to Ben Gurion that made Ben Gurion resign right over the nuclear issue. And I'm not saying Israel killed JFK because I don't think that, but I mean, it just is. But it shows that that these things are aligned with other forces in the empire, and it's plausible to me that because you think about George H.W. Bush, he could say he won the Cold War, which we know there's a lot to unpack there, which we don't need to do, and he won quote unquote the Gulf War. Again, a lot to unpack, but by American standards, he should have sailed to re-election. I mean, incumbents have a big advantage in the U.S. So, I mean, and then what I mentioned to Larry also was that I had more clearly felt that like what happened with Monica Lewinsky and the way that was taking place around the time of the Iraq Liberation Act that Bill Clinton signed, that the Israel lobby may have been, and then what we know about Epstein and so on, and that the way that the Israelis have handled some of the sexual blackmail operations, the CIA seems to have outsourced things like that to them. It makes you wonder about Lewinsky and all of that. And then the Israel lobby seems to be as Mearsheimer and Walth wrote in the Israel lobby, they seem to have been a key driving force behind the war on terror policies. And I mean, how much of an influence has Israel been in terms of making sure that the U.S., after the Cold War especially, stayed on in this role as global gangster, and especially in terms of like carrying out policies that are in line with the like clean break strategy of Netanyahu, a clean break from the peace process, basically. I mean, is Israel a more malign force in domestic politics than even people like Mearsheimer might suggest?
Well, it could be. I mean, they certainly have an incredible impact over politicians because of all the money they can use to fund campaigns, and the way they can really destroy people's reputations, right? By calling them anti-Semites and that sort of thing. It is a very powerful force, and sometimes it does look like the tail's wagging the dog there, So yeah, it's a very troubling state of affairs. Another reason why Israel needs to be reined in greatly,
Yeah.
because it is a very it adversely impacts on a democratic system. Let's put it that way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's when you think about the way that these even high schools, for example, even high schools, but colleges, they get all these calls from donors about how they're not cracking down on. I mean, I don't see another issue like this in U.S. politics where a special interest is that powerful that they're felt like even private high schools run afoul of the Israel lobby and then have to like get punished or, display contrition and things. I can't think of anything else like it. And then the idea is like, if you're talking, it somehow is justified because this group is so oppressed that we must be constantly vigilant about any insults to them or threats to them. But how do you square this oppression with the ability to exert so much power in the most powerful country in the world? It doesn't stand up to any scrutiny.
No, it doesn't. I mean, it's exactly what you're saying. I mean, it's all. I'm sorry, Zionism in the state of Israel are based on lies. I mean, that's just a fact. The idea that they were, that they entered a land without a people. The fact there were people there, they displaced violently. that they're the most moral army in the world, when in fact they appear to be the least moral army. I mean, it's just one myth built upon another myth. But those myths are now falling apart. I do think, and that's their biggest, I think, thing that they're losing in this war in Gaza, is that they just cannot maintain those myths anymore. And without them, I do think they lose their power. I mean, they won't be able to call people up and get people fired because people are going to realize, oh, I guess there are legitimate criticisms of Israel, that don't make you an anti-Semite. So no, I think the truth is coming out now for the first time in a big way. So I think things are changing. I think we will see change in our lifetime on this.
Yeah, do you think a two-state solution is at all viable? I mean, do you think it could be done? To my mind, it's the only thing that can actually save. I don't think they can. I don't think the Israelis can live with the one-state solution. They'd go, but they've done everything to stop a two-state solution from being imposed. Do you think it's possible that there could be a
Yeah,
two-state solution? Basically, you just have to evict. You'd have to just look at that pre-67 map and kick everyone out of the West Bank. That seems to be all the settlements. I mean, they'd have to literally be evicted, most likely,
yeah.
right?
I
I mean,
mean, yeah. I mean, either solution is going to be a painful one. I mean,
yeah.
we have to start with that premise. At this point, again, the two-state solution, because of what Israel's done with the settlements, what it's done with Gaza, and what it's doing with Gaza, are really making a two-state solution unlikely, if not
On
impossible.
purpose. On purpose.
On purpose. Given that, and given I tend to agree with the Palestinians, like Edward Said, who wrote in 1999. He actually wrote an op-ed you can find in the New York Times. I think it's called The One-State Solution. He advocated, even back then, he said that the two-state solution had been destroyed by Israel, and that really the only path forward was a one-state, multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-religious state, one person, one vote. And yet, that's going to be hard to move in that direction. But look, South Africa had apartheid, and its move towards a pluralistic state. It's not perfect. It still has many problems. The United States certainly has moved towards that ideal from a situation in which, Africans were chattel slaves, and then he had Jim Crow. We've certainly made huge improvements, and all of that's been difficult to do. But I think that's the ideal, and it's the ideal that people should try to move towards. And I think there are a lot of certainly Jews in the world who would support that, and maybe even move to Israel on that basis. Whether or not there's a lot of people who live there currently who would want that,
But man,
I
that
don't.
seems like it would be a good trade for them to have your more humanitarian Jewish Israelis rather than the people that go over there now and seem to relish the idea of kicking Palestinians out of their homes and taking them. I mean, I
Exactly.
think
No,
that,
they've now encouraged the worst people to move there. No, I think the only thing to save Israel is a one-state solution. Again, how we get from where we are now to that, I don't know, but I don't think a two-state solution would be any easier. And look, that's already been agreed to years ago, and look at how that's worked out not so well. So,
the main barrier
um,
for either one though is the U.S. can't um, act as a total impediment to sorting it out. I think if it weren't for the U.S., they could have sorted this out at the Security Council. Perhaps, I mean, Britain too. If it weren't for the undemocratic structure of the UN, let's just say there could be a two-state solution arrived at pretty easily. It's
yeah,
just the white supremacy, global white thug buddy, the way that the UN Security Council is constituted gives a ridiculous and unfair amount of power to Britain, France, and the U.S., which is impossible to justify on any sort of moral grounds.
yeah. I mean, why not India, which has a huge, with the second biggest, maybe now the first or second biggest population on Earth? Yeah, no, I mean, we have to yeah, obviously change the Security Council. Um, but
Where
yeah,
can,
I
where
mean, yeah.
so where can you tell us what you're working on now and where people can follow your work?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Aaron, for having me on. I always enjoy our conversations. You can find me on Twitter at Daniel M. Kovalik. And I am an author. I have a number of books I've written. I'm now working on a new book, The Case for Palestine, which will be out in March, but you can pre-order now on Amazon, and that would be very helpful to the book if you did that. So that those are the good places you can find me. You can find all my books on Amazon or at my publisher, Skyhorse Publishing.
Well, we will put a link to the pre-order page for the book. And I want to thank you so much for talking with us again because I think that you have a lot of insight into these issues and you're always out there plugging away, fighting U.S. imperialism and writing about it. So I salute you for that and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Aaron. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much for tuning in. You can now pre-order Dan Kovalik's book, The Case for Palestine, Why It Matters and Why You Should Care. The link is in the show notes. Please do subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon for first access to Devil's Chess Club and for all new and past episodes of the American Exception podcast. And please check out fourdiedtrying.com. These four American leaders were taken off the board back in the 1960s, and I believe that if they had not been, we in the US and the rest of the world would not be in such a bad position today. The silver lining here is that it's becoming clearer and clearer that the empire is, long-term, in a hopeless position. It would seem that we are getting closer to the day when the empire simply cannot effectively kill off all the people it would need to kill off in order to keep the imperial gravy train on track. The American power elite and their allied oligarchs are in the process of losing their empire. With each passing week, their prospects worsen on the devil's chessboard.